How does a Japanese carpenter build a wood fence that outlasts the man who built it, sometimes by 100 years, without a single coat of stain from a store? He burns it, on purpose. He runs a torch across good cedar until the whole face goes black and crusts over, and that layer of char is the reason the wood is still standing long after everyone who called him crazy is gone. I spent the better part of 20 years replacing fence posts every 8 or 10 years, watching cedar go gray and soft, buying stain by the gallon, and doing the whole job over again 2 summers later. I figured that was just the deal with wood left outdoors. It is not the deal. There is a way old builders in Japan and up in Scandinavia treated exterior wood that runs the whole thing on fire, tree sap, and a cheap oil you can still buy today, and it holds for generations, not seasons. Stay with me, because near the end I am going to hand you the exact $2 mix I now put on my own fence, plus the one extra step that stops the thing that actually destroys a finish outdoors. And it is not rain. Most people guess wrong every time. Let me start with the fire, since that is the part that sounds insane until it does not. The Japanese name for it is yakisugi. Yaki means burned, sugi means Japanese cedar, the soft, straight-grained tree they traditionally used, a close cousin to our western red cedar. Put them together and you get burned cedar board. You will also hear it called shosugiban over here. Same technique, just a western reading of the characters. The carpenters would char the face of a plank until the surface turned to a black carbon crust. Let it cool, brush it down, and hang it as siding or set it as fence. This was not for looks. It started around the 1600s, the Edo period, roughly 400 years ago, in packed Japanese cities that kept burning to the ground. A charred outer surface made a house harder to light, and somewhere along the way they noticed the burnt wood was doing more than resisting fire. It stopped rotting. It stopped feeding insects. The stuff simply lasted. Read that part again if you need to. You make wood last longer by burning it. The first time I heard that, I assumed somebody had it backwards. Here is the piece that took me years to really get, and it flips how you think about protecting wood. When you char the surface of a board in a controlled way, you are not just blackening it, you are cooking off the exact part of the wood that rot and bugs live on. Wood is mostly 3 things: cellulose and hemicellulose, which are basically the sugars and starches, the food, and lignin, the tough natural glue that holds the tree together. The fungus that rots your fence, and the beetles that bore into it, are all after those sugars. When you char the face, the heat burns the sugars off first and leaves behind the tough lignin and a layer of nearly pure carbon. Carbon is charcoal. Nothing rots charcoal. You have taken dinner off the table. That is the whole mechanism. Not a coating, not a chemical. You changed what the outside of the wood is actually made of. You know the look I am trying to save you from. A cedar fence that went in golden and warm, and 3 summers later it is gray, fuzzy on the surface, splitting along the top rail, and you are standing there holding a gallon of stain you already know you will be buying again next year. I did that on repeat for 2 decades. The wood was not failing because it was cheap. It was failing because I was protecting it wrong. Let me put a number on what that wrong approach cost me, because it stacks up quietly. A fence post replaced every 10 years is no big deal on its own. But I had a long run of fence, and stain twice a decade at a couple $100 a round, plus a replacement post here and there, plus my weekends, and over 20 years that is easily a couple $1,000s, and a stack of lost Saturdays, all to fight a problem the wood never actually had. The wood was fine. My protection was wrong. Those are 2 very different problems, and one of them is a lot cheaper to fix. And this is not some trick that only lived in old Japanese villages. Charring the bottoms of fence posts to make them last has been done right here in the States, and it has been studied as a wood protection method since at least 1927. Farmers were burning the post ends and setting them in the ground because the charred end held up in the dirt years longer than a raw one. Your great-grandfather may have done it without ever hearing a Japanese word for it. I have to be straight with you here, because the comment section will be, and this is where I split off from half the videos on this subject. Charring is not a force field. The U.S. Forest Products Laboratory, the Federal Wood Research Lab up in Madison, Wisconsin, ran a real study on charred siding not long ago, and their decay testing found that charring by itself did not reliably stop rot across every wood species. In some samples, the charred wood rotted about the same as the plain board next to it. Cypress showed a genuine improvement. Others came out awash. So if a channel tells you one quick pass with a torch makes any board immortal, they are hand-waving. The char earns its keep against fire, against insects, and against the surface weathering the sun causes. And it clearly helps on the right species. But it is one piece of a system, not the whole thing. The old carpenters knew that. Which is exactly why they almost never stopped at the burn. And there is a reason a charred fence on the humid southern coast of Japan tends to outlast a stained one out in bone-dry Arizona, which is backwards from what most people would guess. Hang on to that, because it comes down to the same reason your finish keeps failing, and I will get to it. The second half of this, the part that pushes wood from decades to centuries, came from the other side of the planet. Go up to Norway, and you will find wooden churches called stav churches, built out of pine, some of them standing since around the year 1180. That is more than 800 years. Borgund, one of the famous ones, is pushing 8 centuries old, and it is still wood, still standing, in a climate of snow, freezing rain, and long soaking winters. Wood does not do that on its own. What kept them alive is pine tar. Real pine tar is made by slow-cooking resin-rich pine wood in a covered pit with the oxygen choked down, until a thick black tar drips out the bottom. The Vikings sealed their ships with it before anyone ever brushed it on a church. The people who keep those churches standing brush a fresh coat of pine tar over the entire outside on a cycle, historically about every 4 years, and they have done it for centuries without a break. That is the deal they struck. A cheap renewable coating, put on faithfully, in exchange for a building that would have rotted into the dirt 700 years ago. Sit with that for a second. Over 800 years of the same wooden walls, held up by tree sap and a paintbrush, on a maintenance cycle shorter than most folks keep a truck. Pine tar was not some fringe product either. For a couple of centuries it was one of the big naval store goods. The tar and pitch that entire navies leaned on to seal wooden hulls and preserve rope, shipped by the barrel across the Atlantic. When the whole world's ships were made of wood, keeping wood from rotting was not a hobby, it was national defense. The same formula that can protect your fence used to protect fleets. The honest part of why you have never heard this at the hardware store is not a conspiracy either. A conservator in Norway who studies exactly this, Inger Marie Egenberg at the University of Stavanger, has pointed out that after World War II, there was a flood of factory-made products that worked well enough and cut down on the maintenance, and the old slow methods started fading out. That is the whole story. Nobody buried pine tar and linseed oil. They just lost a race to convenience. There is no money in selling a man a jar of oil he mixes himself and reuses for 10 years. There is plenty of money in selling him a branded bottle every single spring. The old formula did not get suppressed. It got outcompeted by marketing, and within a generation most people forgot it existed. That brings me to the oil, which is the part you can actually put on the fence you already own this weekend. Boiled linseed oil is pressed from flaxseed, and it is what gets called a drying oil. That name fools people. It does not dry the way a puddle dries. It cures. It soaks down into the wood fibers, then reacts with the air and hardens into a solid inside the grain. I am not a chemist, and I am not going to pretend I can walk you through every reaction happening in there. But I have cut into a board a year after oiling it, and I can tell you the protection is down in the wood, not sitting on top like a skin. And that one difference is the thing that should change how you think about every piece of wood you put outside. Think about what a can of polyurethane or a hard film sealer actually does. It lays a plastic-like film on top of the wood. Looks sharp for a year, but wood outdoors swells and shrinks with the seasons. The sun beats on that film all day, and sooner or later it cracks. Water sneaks under the crack, and now it is trapped against the wood with nowhere to escape, and you get the gray, the peeling, the black spots. The film that was supposed to guard the wood is now pinning water against it. The old methods do the exact opposite. The char, the tar, and the oil do not build a wall on top of the board. They protect it from the inside and leave a surface that is meant to slowly wear and be renewed. Same idea I hammered on in the finishing video. A finish that sits on top of the wood is the finish that peels off it. A finish that lives inside the wood ages along with it instead of fighting it and losing. Once that clicks, you quit trying to seal wood shut like a jar and you start working with how it actually weathers. Let me tell you where none of this saves you, because I have paid for some of these lessons. This does not beat bad building. If you stand a raw post straight in wet dirt with no gravel and no drainage, it will rot at the ground line no matter how black you burned it or how much oil you soaked it with, because that spot never gets to dry out. Char and oil are for wood that gets a chance to dry between rains. If your boards are wet or green, do not torch them at all. I torched one once that was still damp from sitting on the garage floor, and the surface steamed, the char flaked off in sheets, and it never set right. Get the wood dry first, at or under about 15% moisture, which for most stored lumber just means dry to the touch and then some. A little moisture meter from General Tools runs about $30 and takes the guessing out of it. And if you are working with a dense, oily species instead of soft cedar, char a scrap first, because it will burn and drink oil differently. While we are on species, this is worth 30 seconds. Traditional yakisugi used sugi, Japanese cedar, because it is soft, light, and straight-grained, so it chars evenly and the surface stays put. Over here, Western red cedar is the closest easy substitute, and it behaves beautifully under a torch. Cypress is excellent too, and it is the one species the Forest Products Laboratory actually saw improve against rot in that study. Siberian larch is a favorite over in Europe for the same reason. And plain construction pine works fine for a first try, which is good, because it is cheap enough that when you scorch your first board too dark and call it rustic, you are not out much. I have a whole rustic section of fence that started as me learning the torch. If you do want to try the char itself, this is how it actually goes, because there is a little more to it than waving a flame around. Work on dry wood, and stand the board up, or lay it at an angle so the heat climbs the grain. Start the torch moving before you aim it at the wood, and keep it moving the whole time, because holding it in one spot just scorches a soft crater. You are looking for the whole surface to go past brown and into black, and then to crack up into that shiny alligator skin texture. That cracking is the sign the carbon layer has actually formed, on soft cedar that takes a surprisingly short pass. Then you have a choice. Leave it heavily charred and it is the most durable and also the most fragile to the touch. It will rub off black on your hand for a while. Or take a brass or stainless wire brush and knock the loose soot back, going with the grain, which leaves a browner, tougher surface that still has the protection but does not mark everything it touches. Traditional crews did it both ways, depending on whether the wood was structure or something people would brush against. Then you oil it, which locks that surface down and feeds the wood underneath. I skipped the brushing step on my first fence panel and leaned on it a week later in a white shirt. My wife has a photograph. I am told it is very funny. Now back to that thing I promised would surprise you. The reason the humid Japanese coast beats dry Arizona. You would assume the wet climate is harder on wood, and rain does rot wood wherever it stays wet and cannot dry. But the thing that quietly wrecks most, finishes out in the open, is not water. It is ultraviolet light, the sun. UV breaks down the surface of wood, and the finish over it, the same way it fades a dashboard and cracks a garden hose, one photon at a time, year after year. That silvery gray a fence turns is UV chewing through the surface fibers. The Japanese coastal builders leaned so hard on charring because that black carbon layer is a sacrificial shield. The sun grinds down the char instead of the wood, and every few years you renew the char instead of replacing the board. Out in dry, sunny Arizona, a thin film stain with no real UV defense bakes and cracks faster than people expect, because the sun is relentless whether the air is wet or dry. Water rots wood where it pools. The sun degrades everything, everywhere, all day long. That is the enemy almost nobody plans around. Let that land. The gray fence in your backyard is mostly sun damage, not water damage, and you have probably been buying product all these years to fight the wrong one. Your own climate decides how often you top this off. In the humid southeast, along the Gulf and up through Florida, rot pressure is high and things stay damp, so drying time and airflow matter more there than almost anywhere. In the Midwest and Northeast, the wood swells every wet summer and shrinks every dry, heated winter, and that constant movement is what cracks rigid film finishes the fastest, which is exactly why a treatment that lives in the wood outlasts them in those swing climates. On the coast, you add salt to the mix. None of that changes the recipe. It just changes how often you walk out with the oil rag, maybe once a year in brutal exposure, maybe every 3 or 4 in a mild spot. Which brings me to the mix I promised, and the extra step that makes it go the distance. This is what I put on my own cedar now, and it is almost embarrassing how cheap it is. You take boiled linseed oil and cut it with real turpentine. Not odorless mineral spirits, real gum turpentine, distilled from pine resin, which helps carry the oil deeper into the grain and smells like a Christmas tree while it does it. Mix it about 1 part turpentine to 2 parts oil. Actually, let me correct that, because it depends on the wood. On soft new cedar, you can run closer to 1:1, so it soaks in fast. On dense or old weathered boards, keep it richer, more like 2 parts oil to 1 part turpentine, so it does not just run off the surface. Shake it in a jar until it clouds up golden. Wipe it on along the grain with a cotton rag. Let it drink for about 15 minutes. Wipe off whatever did not soak in, and let it cure. 1 quart of boiled linseed oil runs about $12 and covers something like 150 square feet, roughly the face of a 2-car garage door. Your cost per fence section lands right around $2. For a post going into the ground, brush real pine tar on the bottom couple of feet first, since that is the part fighting the dirt. On that pine tar, a quick practical note, because straight tar is thick as molasses and a pain to brush in cold weather. The traditional move is to cut it with boiled linseed oil, and sometimes a little turpentine, roughly equal parts tar and oil, until it brushes on like a thin paint. That is close to the mix going on those stave churches, and the mix I put on any post end that meets soil. Genuine pine tar is still sold. Swedish brands like Asan make it, and a can is not expensive once you spread it across everything it will coat. It smells like a campfire mixed with pine sap, and some people love it and some people do not. But the wood does not care what you think of the smell. And this is the step almost nobody does, the one that handles the sun. After the oil has cured a couple of days, warm a little beeswax with a bit of the same oil until it melts into a soft paste, and rub a thin coat over the surface. The oil is guarding the inside of the wood against moisture and rot. The wax is guarding the oil against the sun. Beeswax naturally shrugs off some UV, which is part of why bees build their comb out of it, so it protects the surface layer the sun would otherwise grind down first. One works from the inside out, the other from the outside in. A 1-pound block of beeswax is about $8, and it will cover a whole fence. Redo that surface coat every few years, the same rhythm those church keepers have kept for 800 years, and you are not refinishing anything, you are just topping off. Run the money on that against what most of us actually do. I was stripping and staining my fence every 2 or 3 summers, call it a couple $100 in product, and a burned weekend each round, for 20 years. Add it up, and it is real money and a pile of Saturdays. The mix I use now is a jar of oil, a splash of turpentine, and a block of wax, and I renew the surface coat in an afternoon. The contractor who quoted me $1,100 to strip and reseal the whole run clearly saw me coming. My wife watched me stand in the driveway blackening perfectly good cedar with a torch and asked what the fence had done to deserve it. Fair question, and I did not have a good answer for her yet. One quick word on pressure-treated lumber, since somebody is already typing it. Yes, treated posts resist rot, and they have their place. But it is worth remembering that the old chromated copper arsenate treatment, the stuff that made lumber last for decades, contained arsenic, and it took the EPA stepping in back in 2003 to pull it from wood sold for backyard and playground use. The charring and oil approach the old builders used never needed a regulator to make it safe. It already was. That is not a knock on modern treated wood for the jobs it is right for. It is just a reminder that older and simpler is not the same as worse. You do not need much for tools. A $20 Bernzomatic hand torch off the shelf at any hardware store chars fence boards just fine. I bought a bigger roofing torch for about $50, and all it really got me was a wider flame and a lighter wallet. Hold the torch about 6 inches off the wood, roughly the length of a dollar bill, and move steady until the surface blackens and the grain lifts into that alligator skin pattern. A char depth of around 1/8 of an inch, about 2 credit cards stacked, is plenty. Go deeper, and you are just eating into good wood for nothing. And one safety thing I will not skip past, because it is real, and it is printed on every can. Rags soaked in linseed oil can catch fire on their own, as the oil cures and throws off heat in a wadded-up pile. Lay your used rags flat outside to dry, or drop them in a sealed can of water. Do not ball them up and pitch them in the trash bin. That is the one part of all this you truly do not want to learn the hard way. The old carpenters who built things that outlived them were not smarter than we are. They just did not have an aisle full of bottles promising them a fresh miracle every spring. So they worked out how to make wood last with fire, sap, and oil, and then they passed it hand to hand until somebody stopped. That knowledge was never buried. It just quietly lost to whatever was faster to sell. So go find the grayest, saddest board on your property this weekend, wipe some oil into it, and watch it come back to life while you stand there. That will tell you more than I can from here. Next time I want to get into the wood itself, which species actually earn their keep outdoors, and which ones will rot on you no matter what you brush over the top. Go build something that outlasts you.